We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel with two folks, one I know really well and the other person that I'm getting to know, but covers one of the issues that we cover as an organization. But at this time, I want to just introduce these two panelists, and rather, both of them have short presentations, but I really do want to get to having a conversation among us and then opening up to the audience once we go through a few questions on activism. Our first panel member is Kemp Burdette. Kemp is the Cape Fear Riverkeeper, and he works to protect and improve the water quality of the Lower Cape Fear. He's a Wilmington native who grew up exploring the waterways and swamps that make our area so special. Kemp has lived and traveled around the world as a U.S. Navy research and rescue swimmer. He's a Fulbright scholar and a Peace Corps volunteer. At home and abroad, Kemp has always been interested in the way humans interact with their environment. His academic background is in geology and history, graduating from UNCW magna cum laude with honors, and he holds a Master of Public Administration, also from UNCW. He also holds a certificate in nonprofit management from Duke University. Kemp spends most of his free time with his two daughters, Olivia and Caroline, working in his garden or tinkering in his workshop or exploring the waterways and swamps of the Lower Cape Fear region. And in fact, I think that's where he's most comfortable, is exploring those swamps. But Kemp has been a great partner, and I look forward to the conversation with him on activism. Our second panelist is Kimala Luna, who is the Advancement Outreach and Recruitment Manager for Dogwood Alliance. Kimala is excited to be Dogwood Alliance's very first Advancement Outreach and Recruitment Manager, having come from a small, intentional community in Tennessee. She was raised with the notion that helping to protect our world's natural resources is our responsibility and privilege. Kimala has a BA in Culture and Media from the New York School. And while it sounds like from her resume that Kimala's just started in this work, she's actually been with Dogwood Alliance for more than 10 years. So we look forward to hearing from her as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Kemp.
All right, super excited to be here. And thanks for the introduction. I am most comfortable in a swamp, so forgive me if I'm a little jittery up here. I've got to change the last part of my bio. Now I spend most of my free time trying to convince my 16-year-old and 14-year-old to hang out with me. All right, so I just want to, like as I usually do, try to talk just real quickly about the Cape Fear River to get us kind of centered. And I do appreciate Edgar letting me cross basin lines and enter the Yadkin River basin to talk about the Cape Fear a little bit. So, but yeah, your Yadkin River.
They've heard from me, yes.
So the Cape Fear Basin is kind of the basin that's highlighted there on the left. It cuts right up through kind of the heart of North Carolina. It's the largest watershed completely in North Carolina. It empties directly into the Atlantic Ocean. It's about 6,000 square miles of total watershed. I work on the part of the watershed downstream of where the Deep and the Hall meet, which is around 6,000 square miles. And the major tributaries that we'll talk about a little bit today are the Northeast Cape Fear, the mainstream of the Cape Fear, the Black River, which flows into the mainstream of the Cape Fear, and the South River. And we're going to focus most of our attention today on two counties in particular, Duplin County and Sampson County. Talking about environmental justice, and that is really, I think, at the heart of every single issue that we work on at Cape Fear River Watch. Any environmental issue that involves people involves environmental justice. I've kind of decided that there is no environmental issue that involves people that doesn't have some aspect of environmental justice. And in the Cape Fear, huge environmental justice impacts, whether that's coal ash, whether that's PFAS, which we've heard a little bit about today, or whether it's what I think is probably the best example that I work on frequently of environmental issues and environmental injustice, which is industrial animal agriculture. You'll hear that called, I might even call it CAPOs today. That's an abbreviation for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. But these are big factory type farms. And in the Cape Fear Basin, they're most often swine or poultry farms. And, you know, let's see, I think I've got a picture here. This is a swine factory farm. You can see the barns there. Those kind of pink Pepto-Bismol colored shapes are big cesspools. They're filled with the waste from thousands and thousands and thousands of hogs crammed into that very small area. And what happens on these facilities is that the waste that's stored in these open, frequently unlined pits is then sprayed on the landscape next to these pits. And anybody that lives anywhere near these facilities kind of feels the impacts of that. In fact, if you drove here from someplace else up I-40 or any number of other highways on the way here, you may have felt those impacts as well. I know I certainly did. North Carolina raises about 9 million hogs. We're the second in the nation for hogs. Poultry facilities are slightly different than this. They don't have these big lagoons. The wet waste on poultry facilities is piled up into these massive piles that are frequently left outside on the fields for long periods of time, and then spread on those same fields next to those same neighbors. And North Carolina just recently has become the nation's leading producer of poultry. So we are now producing more chickens than any other state in the country, and we kind of go up and down on turkeys and things like that. But suffice it to say, we are the nation's leading producer of poultry waste in North Carolina. And the densest concentration of these facilities are in the same two counties. The densest concentrations of swine are in Duplin and Sampson County. They're neck and neck on swine, and the densest concentrations of poultry are in those same two counties, Duplin and Sampson. And so you can imagine, you know, what it's like in rural North Carolina. The problem is that what happens on these facilities doesn't stay on these facilities. You know, what happens on these facilities very, very quickly moves away from these facilities, whether it's air pollution from the enormous fans that are keeping these animals alive in these confined spaces, whether it's the aerosolized fecal material that's sprayed from these giant fire hose-sized sprayers out onto the landscape, whether it's you know, wind that picks up poultry litter and blows it across the landscape, whether it's runoff when the waste is applied so heavily to fields that when it rains it runs directly into streams, whether it's the flies and the rats and the buzzards that congregate around these facilities and then move to other places. What happens here impacts all of the neighbors that live around these facilities. And these facilities aren't built at beach towns or gated communities or country clubs or even near affluent neighborhoods. They're built in rural North Carolina, and they're built in communities that are frequently lower wealth communities and communities that are frequently communities of color, which is probably not a surprise to most people in this room. This is the late Elsie Herring at her house immediately next to a swine spray field. She's covering her mouth and nose because of the stench from the spraying. Many people here probably knew Elsie, and many people here probably know what a hero Elsie was to folks in eastern North Carolina. On the hog and poultry issue, I got to be on a panel like this one time in New York City with Elsie, and it was a powerful experience. So Cape Fear Riverwatch, we've made hundreds and hundreds of flights. Well, not hundreds and hundreds. We've made well over 100 flights over the Cape Fear Basin. I've taken hundreds and hundreds, thousands, in fact, samples. It is not at all uncommon to see violations of swine and poultry waste rules. It's not at all uncommon to see dramatic exceedances of the state's kind of safe levels for bacteria or nutrients. And yet, very little is changing on the issue of CAFOs in North Carolina. And I want to, say probably two, I'm going to kind of end with two opinions on this little presentation part. And one of them I think is pretty commonly held about what one major reason for that is, and that's the North Carolina General Assembly. The North Carolina General Assembly, which aggressively opposes efforts to improve environmental justice in North Carolina. And I think a lot of people probably know that. I think the most obvious example of that is the laws that the General Assembly passed following the nuisance lawsuits that were brought by residents of Eastern North Carolina against Smithfield. And just to quickly summarize that, to point out how how aggressively the General Assembly opposes environmental justice in North Carolina. 5 lawsuits were brought against Smithfield. All 5 of those lawsuits were won. Those were jury trials, so 60 jury members all agreed that Smithfield was guilty of impacting the quality of life for people who live near these facilities, people that, like in that map I showed you. Following that decision, Smithfield Food had their, I will say their elected officials in the General Assembly passed 2 laws that prevented anyone else in this room or anyone else in North Carolina from ever filing nuisance lawsuits in North Carolina again. So they purchased those legislators, and they had those legislators pass laws that protected the industry. That's the commonly understood one. I think this might be a little less commonly understood, or maybe a little less commonly said, but I think the other major problem in North Carolina and the other major entity that is hindering the improvement of environmental justice in North Carolina is the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. I think despite a lot of big talk about how they care about environmental justice and how much they are doing to improve environmental justice, I see very little of that. And the best example I can think of there to wrap up on is that 7 years ago, Cape Fear Riverwatch and the Waterkeeper Alliance and the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network sued DEQ because we said, hey, when citizens file credible complaints, when citizens that live near these facilities, when groups like ours, watchdog groups, file credible complaints, that those complaints go into what we call a black hole. We called it the black hole case. And that DEQ doesn't respond, and that there's no indication that they are going to respond or how they're going to respond. And so we filed a lawsuit, and as frequently happens in lawsuits against state agencies, there was a settlement, and out of that settlement, DEQ said that they were going to do better, and one of the things that they committed to doing was to creating a guidance document that would talk about how they're going to respond to citizen complaints. And 7 years later, there's been, for what I can tell, and I've been pestering them on a regular basis, there's been zero progress on that document 7 years later. So we still have no idea how the state responds to these complaints, and we still get almost no information from the dozens and dozens and dozens of complaints that we make.
Thank you, Kemp. Kimala?
Sure. I wanted to talk about the landscape of activism and environmental justice in the South from the lens of my environmental nonprofit, because I think it's really interesting. Can everybody hear me, by the way? Is this working? Yeah. So Dogwood Alliance started in 1996, and it was really a grassroots organization, and a lot of our actions looked like this, like direct actions. One of our biggest campaigns was against the office supply companies, so Office Depot, Staples. You can see in the picture in the lower left-hand side, that was taken in Asheville, but at the time that it was taken, there was something like 146 satellite actions happening at the same time across the country. So it was a combination of really good organization, and then also our executive director, Dana Smith, met with the CEOs of this corporation and convinced them to fly in a plane flown by Southwings over some of the clear cuts that their company was responsible for. And through that experience, because there is such a disconnect between the manufacturing of something and what's being taken, the resources being taken, we were able to have some major successes. And to go over that would take a really long time. So just to summarize, the successes that we had resulted in significant increase in production of recycled paper in the US, and an increase in acreage of forest certified to FSC standards in the US. So a lot of the FSC standard stuff you see now in Staples and Office Max is because of the work we did, and also the Yum paper products, the paper products that you get your fast food in, are recycled now because of that work. So we've always followed the threat, and that is paper production and industrial forestry. And this is the impact that those industries have on the landscape. As you can see, there's just a tiny little wedge of native hardwoods, but a massive section of clear-cut drainage, rows of loblolly pines, an area converted to tree farm. And so because we followed the threats, it's led us to our current 10-year campaign against the wood pellet biomass industry. And we also we fought threats to our forest and frontline communities. As we dove deeper into the work against the threats against forests, we realized that this is often a social justice issue because of where the industries take place and who's impacted. So we partner with communities across the US South to develop economic solutions that work with and for our forests. And our mission has changed over time. Originally, as a grassroots environmental nonprofit, our mission was we protect forest from industrial logging. But this is an environmental justice issue. So now our mission is Dogwood Alliance advances environmental justice and climate action by mobilizing diverse voices to protect southern forests and communities from industrial logging. So that encompasses a much wider frame, and it also involves a partnership. So we work in 14 states across the US South. Here are the 14 states, and you can see that our headquarters are in Asheville, but that's changing because our office has gone remote. So we have a lot more organizers that are located remotely. And so I want to talk about what biomass is. The EU had this policy, and you might have been hearing a lot about wood pellet biomass, but I'm going to tell you a lot more about it because everybody should know. For some history, the EU had this policy that they created around 2012 that they were going to cut their carbon emissions by 20% by the year 2020, which sounds like a really great policy. Go EU. But the way that they decided to handle that is by clear-cutting our southern forests in the US South and turning them into wood pellets to be shipped overseas in big diesel ships to be burned not for heat, but for electricity. So a couple of things. We simply cannot keep up with the demand. We can't supply that much forest as much as we're replanting our natural old growth biodiverse forests with loblolly pine plantations. We just can't keep up. The other thing is this is just completely desecrating the forests in the US South. We are responsible for 2% of the world's forests, but also 25% of the world's paper and timber. And so it's just, it's really having a large impact. And it's having a large impact on predominantly Black communities located in the US South who are under-resourced and are already experiencing an incredible amount of environmental injustice. So if you can look at this map, this is, I gotta catch up to myself, hold on one second. On this map, the blue dots show where the biomass facilities are located, and the orange squares show communities impacted by environmental injustice. Communities who are already experiencing a higher degree of pollution due to industrial development in that area. Biomass plants are twice as likely to be located in communities impacted by environmental injustice. And these plants, as you've already heard, they run 24/7. Local residents never get a break from the constant noise, dust, heavy truck traffic, and pollution. And people living next to the pellet plants often have a lower life expectancy and poorer health. So keep this map in your mind, right? This is the historic cotton production in the US. So as you can see from this map, I'm going to go back again. Boom, boom. The history and legacy of extracting from and harming black people in the region has gone on for centuries. It's a pattern that keeps repeating, and it tells us a story of who's continuously sacrificed in the name of economic progress for a small few, and I mean a really small few, because nobody is getting rich off of these industries who live in the towns that these industries are going up in. So it operates much like all industries in the US. It's a massive pollution generating plants that moves into small rural towns of color and promises jobs, but they usually provide minimal local jobs. They bring in their own people, they strip the resources of the surrounding land and pollute the local communities, and we're seeing cancer and asthma rates skyrocket. So this is an example of one article that's a peer-reviewed study that details how burning wood pellets for energy endangers local communities' health, but there's so many of these articles, and this industry is still operating. Got through that. So I hadn't heard this today, but where am I? Sorry. Okay, here we go. So due to the focus of our work being against big industry and working together with impacted community members, our organization has become organically more just. So us as an environmental nonprofit, we've deepened our internal anti-racist behavior, taking extensive personal inventory and moving through deep-seated conflicts together. We also externally are expanding our regional network and building even more transformational partnerships. So our organization's purpose isn't being defined by us. We're actively being defined by it and the community around us. I really love this quote by Tracy Green Washington that goes, progress happens at the speed of relationships, which happen at the speed of trust. So it's really a relationship building movement. And so that's why in the last decade, we've shifted from a grassroots organization to a policy and advocacy organization. We're seeing the same story in town after town. The health impacts of the community members we work alongside are being ignored and actively attacked by these industries, and we need to see change at the federal level. We need to see policies in place that protect this planet's health and well-being and its inhabitants. And this is a picture from last year with 35 leaders from impacted communities in front of the White House. We held a press conference, and then right after that, we went into a series of EPA meetings. And typically, EPA meetings are like a buttoned-up affair, but these EPA officials were hearing directly from impacted community members, and so there was like banging on the table, and everybody was crying, and like that's really what we need to see, because that's like the only reasonable, humane reaction to what's happening. And then I hadn't seen this till recently, but these are the principles of environmental justice that were written in 1991 at the delegates to the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit in DC. And so if you haven't seen these or read them, I think that it's like a really important moment for us all to consider the pledge of, it's supposed to be the principles of environmental justice, but it's important for us all as individuals to take this pledge, but also encourage our organizations to take this pledge, because it sets a standard that we need to all take at a much higher level. And I'll just end with, somebody else had this slide too, which means we're all on the same page, but it really is going to take us all, showing up in whatever way we can and connecting with each other. Like, we're trying to build a network, a big network across the South. These threats that we're all experiencing are the same, and they're all connected. And it's like, whenever I feel truly lost, I always look to nature, and the way that crows kind of hold their territory and like attack much larger birds because they move together and they work together. We can be those crows, and that's it.
Thank you, Kimala. Thanks for those presentations, and I'm going to ask the obvious question, since we are a panel to talk about environmental justice activism. What does it mean to you, Kemp, environmental justice activism?
Well, what does it mean to me? I think it does kind of go back to that piece about, if you're doing environmental work that has a single human being involved in it, then you're doing environmental justice work, right? And so if you're failing to recognize that environmental justice work is the same as environmental work, then you're really doing, whatever issue you're working on, you're doing yourself a huge disservice, because you're missing out on a huge amount of information that you can gain from working with communities that are directly impacted by these issues, and you're missing out on a huge amount of power. You're missing out on that ability to work together with other people to gang up on hawks. I think it is. I don't really see that there's any way to separate environmental justice action from environmental activism.
Kimala?
I just find it so alarming the deeper I dive into this work, and that it feels like so on purpose, the way that industrial development takes place and the communities that are experiencing the worst impacts of environmental injustice, that to me it just feels like a massive alarm that none of us are safe, and that this isn't working the way that it is, and that we all need to be really sounding the alarm, because we've known we needed to solve the climate crisis since the late 80s, and we have not moved the needle very far. So I guess for me, environmental justice feels like an emergency.
Okay. Kimala, you are in a new position, the first one in this role of advancement, outreach, and recruitment. So tell us a little bit about what that role involves and why Dogwood decided they needed someone in this particular type of role.
I think it's because we have, so when you are trying to build something really big, you have peaks and valleys, and we have a programs department and we have an advancement department. So the programs department is really focused on campaigns and moving those needles forward in terms of getting policies incorporated. My job is about building a community. They call it like a brand community, a community that kind of speaks in one voice and shares the same message.
Great, thank you. Kemp, you mentioned, Kimala mentioned the 17 principles. And about 2 years ago, you had the opportunity to spend some time with two of the planners of that event in Washington. You actually had a chance to fly them over. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we know oftentimes the work that we do here has to be influenced by folks that are not necessarily here, but maybe at places in DC or other places who can help amplify the message.
Yeah, that was a pretty special day. I took two folks from the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Board Committee group.
And maybe I should clarify, Richard Moore,
yeah,
who is one of the co-chairs of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and Pat was one of the original planners, but he's not on the council, but yes.
Yeah, so we flew over eastern North Carolina, and we kind of created a flight that was going to show a lot of issues. So we looked at the wood pellet industry. We looked at the Enviva plant up in Sampson County. We looked at swine and poultry CAFOs. We looked at biogas. We looked at the landfill in Sampson County, and we just did this big tour where we got to see these facilities frequently the only way you can see them, which is from the air, because they're very intentionally kind of out of sight. I think it was a very powerful flight, and I think those gentlemen, even with as much experience as they had, I think seeing it from that perspective and seeing the kind of concentration in Duplin and Sampson County, were really struck by the issue. And what was especially special for me is that, I kind of put together some of the photos from the trip, and I kind of showed them, and I kind of annotated some of them, and then sent those to Richard, and those made it to the White House and into a meeting where they talked about, hey, this is a real problem in North Carolina, and we've seen it with our own eyes. So that was pretty.
And Richard was actually talking about that last week. I haven't had a chance to tell you that, but he raised that concern again last week. You've talked a little bit about the experience of the Cape Fear and the CAFOs and the wood pellets and some of the other issues. PFAS is one of the most recent ones. Do you want to talk a little bit about that challenge and what that activism means to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, so in 2017, I picked up a newspaper at the same time as everybody else in my town picked up a newspaper and read this story about, who picks up newspapers anymore, but read this news article on my phone or wherever it was about this thing called PFAS and that it was in our drinking water, and I was like, you know, what is PFAS? At the same time, you know, 200,000 other people in my community asked the same question, and it was a startling experience, and it was a real eye-opener. I think it's probably done more in the lower Cape Fear to get people really thinking about drinking water and the safety of their drinking water than anything that I've ever experienced. And I think it's done more to make people skeptical about whether or not it's safe to assume that every time you turn on your tap water that what comes out of it is safe. And even broader, you know, whether or not it's safe to assume that, like, someone's got you covered, right? That someone is making sure that your air is safe to breathe, that your, you know, water's safe to drink, that the fish are safe to eat, that you know, that somebody's not, you know, dumping something right upstream from where your kids like to swim. And so for that, I guess, you know, maybe it's good in kind of a sad way that at least people are really questioning, you know, how careful you need to be in today's world.
Do you think that's led to more activism and maybe even level the playing field in terms of who feels like they can be affected by environmental injustices?
I think it has. You know, PFAS is an interesting issue. Right on the very face of it, you say to yourself, well, you know, I mean, that's everybody. Every single person turns on tap water. I mean, it was our public utility authority. Everybody drank that water. And so, you know, your first impulse might be to say, well, you know, it just affected everybody equally. But when you just think even just a little bit more about it, that wasn't the case at all. You know, very quickly, we started to hold these forums in Wilmington. As soon as we found out, we started to bring in as many experts as we could, experts from NC State who had, you know, basically written the article that kind of broke the story, pediatricians and, you know, lawyers and water treatment folks. And the number one question, I mean, it was probably 50% or more of the questions that we got from the audience and that these experts got from the audience was, well, what kind of filter do I need to buy to filter this stuff out of my family's drinking water supply? And it became really clear that you know, that was not a surprising thought, that you want to do whatever you can as quickly as you can to protect your family, but that line of thinking was completely overlooking the fact that some people were going to be buying filters and leaving everybody else who wasn't buying filters to drink whatever water was there. And so we worked real hard at kind of trying to turn that on its end and say, look, you know, we don't need to be putting filters on our taps. We need to be putting filters at these industrial sites where they're dumping this stuff into a public drinking water supply. And we don't need to pay for these filters, and we don't need to place that burden on people who really can't afford it. We need to place the burden on the people that have been dumping this stuff into the rivers for so long. So it was a little bit of a different way of thinking and dealing with an issue that was so widespread.
Thank you. Kimala, you've talked a little bit about wood pellets and where they are. Can you talk a little bit more about how the industry is affecting North Carolina and where those plants are in North Carolina?
Yeah, I think there's...
And what Dogwood is doing about it at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, we worked in Sampson County, and we worked in Richmond County, I believe, and a few others. I believe there's 4 in North Carolina. And so what we've done is a number of different things. we've attended like a lot of different public hearings and tried to raise awareness around the public hearings. We've done demonstrations. We've gone to the EPA headquarters. We've appealed to DEQ, and I believe like in at least 2 or 3 out of the 4 cases, we were not able to stop the facility being built. Yeah.
Okay. This sounds like it could be very depressing. What do you do to release the stress that you obviously feel from doing this work, Kimala?
I obviously, yeah, it is it's very stressful. I think just getting out in nature and also like the connections that we build, like the friendships that we do make, and the deeper that we build those connections, the bigger we kind of dream together. So like the DC trip last year was huge and really incredible. And after we had the EPA meeting, which was really emotional, it was like everybody just wanted to listen to 90s R&B and like do a dance party, you know? Like, so there's this like combination of like joy and resilience and like really just letting yourself kind of go there with the grief because it's totally real and valid.
Kemp, what do you do?
Well, I mean, part of it is just hanging out with part of the way that I kind of am restored is hanging out with a lot of good people doing really hard work. And so, you know, we celebrate our wins when we get our wins, and we get a surprising number of wins to be such a kind of in such a David and Goliath situation. But you know, there's a bunch of Riverkeepers in North Carolina, and we get together on a regular basis, and we're a pretty tight crew, and we like to celebrate when we have some wins. And it's just inspiring just to be around people that are like, you know, we're doing this work because we know it's the right thing to do, and we're working really hard at it, and we know we don't always win, but it is. I am. And in our own organization, I mean, we've got, you know, I walk into work and like somebody's doing something, and it's very inspiring. I don't lack inspiration.
So Edgar lets you in his watershed every now and then.
He lets me in. Yeah, he tells me about his wins up there with Alcoa, and I get to go.
One of the things that we haven't talked about is engaging young people. We know that many of us in this work are getting up in age. And so what do you do in your work to activate young folks to show them that there is a reason for doing this work and that, in fact, it's all about their future? Kemp.
Well, I used to be really worried about this, and I'm not so worried anymore. And I think it's because I mean, it's no secret that a lot of environmental groups lean kind of older, right? It's especially like a group like mine, like a membership type group, right? And so you kind of lean older. You also kind of lean whiter. And I used to worry about the older part especially, but we started to just kind of try to make changes in our organization. We started to try to bring more young people like onto our board. We started hiring new folks that were young, and you know, I think the way it's just kind of organically happened that we've got a lot of young people around, and I think the way that you make sure that they stay engaged is like you give them something important to do, and then you let them do it, and you don't try to get in the way of that. And it's like I said, I mean, I walk into the office and somebody's doing something, I'm just like, I don't even need to be here. You guys got this well under control.
Great.
I partner with a youth organization, STM Multimedia Corporation, and they're actually having the ribbon cutting ceremony tomorrow. But they do youth programs where they teach young people about podcast development, marketing, video editing, and through partnership with them, we run a summer internship where an intern teaches school-age children about biodiversity. So it's really fun, and I try not to bring in like the intense energy that I brought into this room there, you know, and like just really acknowledge like the ways that creativity can have a massive impact.
Okay. Yeah. I want to open it up in case there's someone in the audience who'd like to ask this group questions. They've been doing this work for a very long time. Any questions from the audience at this point?
Sherri, can you talk about your work?
Sure.
I got you here.
I was trying not to talk so much, but Sampson County's already been talked about some. I co-founded an organization in Sampson County called the Environmental Justice Community Action Network, and you've already heard, I guess, mostly negative things about Sampson County. We are #2 in hog production, #1 in turkey production, have the largest landfill in the state, which accepts trash from 73 of the 100 counties in the state. We have an in vivo wood pellet factory there. There's a Smithfield processing plant in the middle of town. And there are 2 biogas facilities, one on the Sampson County side of the line and the other one just over the Sampson County line. And so we have a lot of pollution in the county. E.J. Can was started to originally deal with, as the community identified, the area called the Snow Hill community where the landfill is located. The landfill has been there now for 50 years in a predominantly African American community and has obviously had all of the negative impacts that you would expect for a landfill to have in a community. There has never been a health assessment there. The community is not aware that there is or has ever been an emergency evacuation plan, although this landfill is about 1,300 acres in size. We now know, as a result of recent studies, that PFAS from the cleanup of the Cape Fear was dumped in that landfill, so that it is now leaching out of the landfill. E.J. Can has actually, in conjunction with Southern Environmental Law Centers, sent a notice of intent to sue the landfill because of the PFAS, based on RCRA. There has been something good, so I won't say it's all bad. Because of the Biden administration's ARPA funding, one community in Sampson County that had been trying to get water infrastructure for at least 30 years was able to get the largest grant from the state of $13.28 million to be able to hook up 350 homes free of charge to those homeowners, and it would have never happened. They would never be able to get water had it not been for the funding from the federal government. Unfortunately, the federal government is also doing some things that aren't very helpful to Sampson County. There is a program that is subsidizing digesters through the Department of Agriculture called the Rural Energy for America program. And USDA just this year decided to change that program so that if a permitted hog farm comes to them and says, we're going to place one of those things in an impacted community, they get an automatic 15 points without requiring that the best available technology be used on that facility. So we're trying to fight that. So there are a lot of fights. As I alluded to earlier, E.J. Can has decided that most of our fights are going to have to be done at the federal level because there isn't a friendly General Assembly for us here in North Carolina to affect anything that we hope to be able to be done. We do, as you heard earlier, have a number of partnerships with key partners now with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, with Clean Air Carolina, with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with Appalachian State, with Southern Environmental Law Center, with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. I believe, and it is my belief, that Sampson County is the worst county in the state. And a good friend of mine who is from Robeson County and I were in a meeting together one day and we were going around the table introducing ourselves. And that friend said in a public meeting, I used to say Robeson County was the worst county in the state, but I can honestly say now Sampson County has us beat. So unfortunately, that is our reputation in terms of the kinds of challenges that this rural county has. The second part of that challenge, I believe, as a result of doing work with the federal government, is that the conversation about challenges in rural America and environmental justice is not where it should be. Most people hear environmental justice and they think Flint, they think Jackson, Mississippi, they think other urban areas, but not necessarily rural areas. So I hope very much that EJ Can is that voice on panels or wherever the opportunity is to talk about those challenges and how unique the same types of issues that are being worked on, whether it's transportation or energy or any other issue, is a very different conversation. We hope that we will be able to be successful with getting additional grants, but we also recognize that we have been turned down for some applications that we've submitted. And our partners and I are convinced that because there's so much focus on shovel-ready projects, that there isn't a real understanding that rural communities are not necessarily where urban communities are when they get ready to do those projects. And that was brought home to me last week by one of my mentors, Harold Mitchell, who is a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and in his presentation talked about the fact that federal grants now talk about shovel-ready projects, and his comment was communities that he's working in oftentimes need somebody to help them find the shovel first. And so I think that's the way that a lot of what's happening needs to be looked at as we're doing these projects here. Doesn't mean that I'm going to stop, because I'm not. Sampson County is where I grew up, is where I chose to move back to. But there's a huge recognition that not only is it a challenge because of what's there, it's also a challenge because of who lives there. Because these polluting industries have meant that folks have been able to buy homes and send kids to school and do the other kinds of things that all of us would like to be able to do for our families, while not recognizing that those same industries that are providing them with a decent living are the same industries that are killing them every day. Yeah. So we have to continue the process that we have, but I'm proud to have a board, like the board that we have now. Kemp sits on our board. Jeff Robbins sits on our board. So I'm proud that we have some folks who are willing to be in this fight with us to try and make positive change in Sampson County. And I want to open it up. I didn't intend to talk much about me, but Sampson County got talked about a lot today. So I'd like to open it up if there are questions from the audience.
Looking for a little wisdom on the federal funds that are maybe trickling down. Have you all had any successes within your organizations on getting plugged into, the Justice 40 funds or, other funds, and anything that you can share with folks here about that?
Is that to anyone of us?
Yeah, to anyone. If anyone.
Okay. It has been challenging. The federal government has created tic-tac centers, and they've created grant makers to provide services. But the communities that we work with, both through the work that I do with EJ Can, but also through North Carolina Conservation Network, and we've been working really hard. My colleague Will Hendrick, who presented this morning, have found that it's difficult to get the information from those centers. It's oftentimes hard to find out who you need to be talking to, and then when you talk to them, oftentimes they don't have the answer or aren't quite sure. I've even had someone from one of the tic-tac centers tell me they were learning as they went, which was very disturbing to hear that kind of thing from organizations that have received a lot of money from the federal government to help communities like this, but don't have the relationships, didn't have the relationships. So many of us in communities are trying to figure out how many of these tic-tacs got picked because they did not have community relationships, though they're having to build the relationships to help the communities that really need the help. So far, I won't say it's been really positive, but it hasn't exactly been negative. It's been more frustrating, I think, is the word I would use at this point. Edgar?
Sherri, you serve on the current Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and I think some of us were concerned when the change occurred. And we had a couple of folks who were advocating for our environmental justice community in West Baden with the Alcoa pollution there, and they were not reappointed to the board. Now we have this new board. Do you see any opportunities for activism targeted at that new board? Many of us have just gone through the review of the agency goals that I understand are being submitted to the new board, and many of us were critical of some of those goals, particularly with the Department of Environmental Quality, to Kemp's earlier point about them being part of the problem and giving lip service to this. And so, do you see any potential for activists to impact or influence what that group is going to be doing going forward?
I do. I can't give up hope. I have to be positive about the process. I will also let Virginia Guidry respond to that if she'd like to, since she's one of the co-chairs sitting in here with us. I know that members of the new board are committed to this work and committed to making change wherever possible. But we also realize that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. One of the problems that I see at this point as an activist is that because DEQ was so bad at working and responding to community, that there has not been the participation of the community on the public comment period that we would like to see. So in trying to address that, the new council is actually going to have meetings in community to show that there is a commitment from the council to hear from community and to incorporate into whatever that final report to the governor looks like, reflects what we've heard from the community. But this is really a partnership. The advisory council members can't be the only voices. The only way that the council can be effective is if the community partners with us to make sure that the work that comes out of that council reflects the concerns and the priorities of communities. And Virginia, I'll let you, because you're at a higher level than I am.
Well, we're in it together, but I appreciate the question about that, and I think part of the difference is just the composition is different. Now with the state agencies occupying half the seats, which there's pros and cons to that, right? But the good thing is that it brings in the state agencies to that work, very intentionally so. But I think it does reduce the number of community members that can be on the board. So there's a little bit of a shift, I guess, in purpose and trying to broaden the purpose to more state agencies than just DEQ. To the point about the meetings in communities, we're working on getting out to the West Baden community. That's one of the ones that's on our list, hopefully, and some of it is just logistics that have to be figured out and everything. But we definitely heard that in the first meeting from public comment, actually from Jasmine Washington, and have heard that, through other events as well. And so, I would say that we're working on it, and I think there are actually a lot of opportunities for input. You mentioned the state agency goals, that public comment period just closed, but that work will be ongoing. You can always reach out to individual council members too. And then the next thing is the EJ Hub, and there will be some opportunities for public input on that, which is being led largely by the subcommittee for the mapping tool and the EJ Hub. But I would, just kind of stay tuned, and we can help keep you plugged into that, because there really is a goal to have that community input, and there's actually a specific community engagement subcommittee to help guide the council on that. So really trying to implement some of those things in a fairly short period of time.
Other questions?